Hi everyone, so the Diablo 4 first beta weekend is over and I gotta say, man, I had a blast of it and I hope most of you guys did too. I already made my first impressions video on Saturday after my first stream and that was already really great, and I will have another one going a lot more in depth about like my feedback, about also the issues that I have with the game, some bugs and all these kind of things very soon. So stay tuned for that. I just wanted to use the time that I had in this beta as much as possible. I did try to pump out a few videos here and there to keep you guys. I did try to get out some videos for you guys as well, so that you can be prepared for next weekend for the open beta. And speaking of preparation, I have some builds to share here. So I already highlighted this in my announcement video for the beta. I have this channel here on my Discord server. You can find that in the description with all the builds that I was actually experimenting with, which is a total of 13 builds. So I leveled 8 characters to 25. Well, one of them died at 24.5 on hardcore, so rip. But yeah, I've been trying all of the classes multiple times, and I have this channel here right now. It's a little bit messy, but I guess it gets the job done for what we have right now. So I have usually like a 1-minute clip here that we took directly from the stream with me explaining the setup in a few words. Obviously, these are level 25 builds, so this is like very basic stuff. I usually didn't really include like any like itemization or anything like that, just like a bit of a skill tree. I have them listed out here. I've already started doing it, and I will continue putting out these videos over the week to get them all out before Friday, so that everyone can be prepared if you want some guidance for some of these builds, if you want to try out various things. Obviously, this is not everything you can do, so we just had limited time, and the things that I was doing were not necessarily the best either. So just some stuff that I found that kind of worked after some experimentation. So we have those 5 rogue builds here, we have 5 Sorc builds, and 3 for the Barb, and was kind of running out of time there. So I might try a bit more after I've done some Druid and Necro stuff on the upcoming weekend. So I just wanted to highlight this. Also, I gotta say, yeah, a lot of people keep comparing these builds and say that, you know, this one looks really trash, this one is really good. You have to keep in mind that this beta is level capped at 25, where you're not really supposed to have that many like synergistic legendary pieces and very high item level loot. So you see this, for example, here, this is my sorceress, or one of them, and I have like, for example, 500 attack power because I don't really have like super crazy gear or super crazy weapon. And I just have like mostly random pieces that dropped on the way. I also didn't really use the codex powers that allow you to put certain legendary powers on your items, for example. I was just trying to do this like as close as possible to like a realistic, like, you know, game launch scenario, so to say, where you don't really have a lot of access to a lot of items, a lot of legendaries and these kind of things. And I see a lot of other guys that, you know, share their builds, and they have like this, you know, item power 400 stuff that they found from this elite that I made a video about. I didn't do any of that, and I just had like, you know, maybe 2 or 3 kind of synergistic pieces that helped me out with a bit of damage buffs or so. And other than that, I didn't use any of this like super crazy stuff. I got a lot of comments from people that were looking at some of my clips, for example, and then telling me that they're deleting the butcher in 5 seconds and no boss lives longer than 2 seconds. And yeah, okay, the balance is a bit wacky, but in general, it makes sense when you're completely overgeared at level 25 and you have like 5 different legendary pieces that, you know, together quadruple your damage or something like that. So I was kind of like trying to steer clear of that, and yeah, have just like some basic setups that work. I have to say that both the rogue and the sorcerers felt like pretty well-rounded classes. I was having a lot of fun and pretty good success with almost anything I've tried. Especially the sorcerers felt like pretty easy mode in the early levels with lightning, for example. And then we had, for example, some of the fire builds with Hydra being a very prominent feature in most sorcerers builds. And they have like a lot of really cool, interesting things to play with, especially with the enchantment slots. The rogue also has pretty viable builds with basically any of the core skills, and even some extra stuff like a trapper build. So you can make some stuff work like that. You have different combinations of utility spells that you can get into your builds. So that actually feels really cool to play around with the skill tree. And you don't really have to take like, for example, my builds 1-to-1. You can always like, you know, adjust a skill or two, get in another utility slot, and just try something for yourself. Especially in the rogue, you can experiment with the different imbuements. There's a smoke grenade, There's the dash, the shadow step, the ultimates, even with the shadow clone. So there's a lot of stuff that it kind of makes sense to put into most of the builds, and you can design it to suit your own like taste. From all the gameplay so far, I have to say that the Barbarian definitely felt the weakest in the early game, but I think this also is a result of the Barbarians having a lot more item slots than most other classes, and you become more powerful as you go because you get more stats from your items later on, and you get more legendary powers later on. And in fact, there are some of those legendary powers that are like Barbarian only, that only go on the weapons, for example, and they are massively powerful. They're like game changers. And it seems to me that the Barbarian is actually mostly designed around those. So if you don't have any of those big legendary powers, you will feel a bit weak. But there's a way around that, which is Thorns. So I actually had really good success just stacking a bunch of Thorns synergies, and this kind of like carries you through the early game, and you can do almost anything else like however you want. There are some things on the passive tree that just give you a good bunch of Thorns and some skills that synergize with it, and you kind of just kill stuff by getting hit, and that works pretty well. But the fact that you have to be in melee range with basically any Barb build, maybe people can play it a bit ranged, for example, but that's about it. It does make it a bit more of a struggle. You do take a lot of damage in melee range. You have to dodge certain elite affixes. You have to dodge even like trash monster abilities sometimes because they can stun you and deal a lot of damage. So you're just like in more danger as a Barbarian. And it felt like a bit harder to play than the other classes. I wouldn't really discourage anyone from trying the Barb. As I mentioned, it gets better, and the Thorns can kind of carry you, but you do have to be careful in the early game with like the lack of defensive tools and the lack of damage in some cases as well, until you get a few more pieces to work with. In my opinion, Blizzard could definitely look into this and maybe readjust the tuning on Barb a little bit to make them a bit stronger in the early game, and then just make sure that they end up somewhere where they want them to be later on with all the legendary powers included. So they could just maybe like boost the base skills a bit and reduce the legendary powers a bit, so that it just like has a bit of a more smooth difficulty curve. But outside of that, I gotta say that the early game progression feels really good. So you do get these like item upgrades, you get these legendaries, and sometimes you just find something that makes you completely rethink your entire build. You get like an item that boosts a certain skill, for example, or boosts your damage under certain conditions, and you might want to like adjust your build a little bit to actually meet that condition. For example, to add in a stun or to add in barriers or these kind of things. And it just really has you like question your choices all the time. And you can always do these like little adjustments by unspecking a few points on the tree and just trying out something else. And that's really the most amazing part. And also with the way that I was actually leveling those characters, I tried various different things. For example, I played through the campaign a few times, but I also had other characters where I skipped that entirely. And instead I just did like dungeon grind, or I was going around in outdoor zones doing these events, or I had another character that I used to just explore everything and gather all the altars of Lilith. And there's definitely like a lot of variance in the things you can do, especially with the Renown system that rewards you for these one-time completion bonuses, so that you get these extra skill points, for example, and you want to do that on one character, for example, and then do something else on another character. So there's definitely a lot of stuff to do, and that feels really cool in my opinion. And since I was leveling completely different builds every time, it felt like I had a very different journey with all of my characters, which was pretty amazing. So it didn't really even feel that repetitive or so. I did stick to the build that I was trying to make with my characters. So even when I got like a really huge upgrade, for example, here I was playing a flurry rogue, like a melee version of a rogue. But sometimes you might find like a really big crossbow and you might be tempted to respec, but I didn't do that. It would probably make sense to do that, as I had just explained. Sometimes you get these big item drops, you get a big legendary for a certain skill or something like that, that might tempt you to respec. But on the other hand, you can also just like stick to whatever you wanted to make, and it just works fine. But I think realistically later on, despite all the build guides, despite all this, preparation that you might want to be doing for, playing exactly this one thing, it might be just way more fun and way more efficient to just play around the RNG of stuff that you're getting. So sometimes you just find a big item and you can just, unspec a few points, change your skills around, and, just swap it back and forth to whatever you have the the best stuff available for. Personally, I'm already hyped for the second beta weekend, so I'm probably going to repeat something similar to what I was just doing and just try to get as much done as possible with the Druid, the Necro, and maybe I'm going to go back to some of the other classes here to get a few more things done there as well. Obviously, for the final release, this is all the info that we really have, and a lot of things will remain a mystery until the release, but I think that overall the build diversity is actually really high, so I'm really impressed by how good the skill tree feels, by how many options you can play around with, and it all feels kind of useful to me. And obviously some things are, better designed for certain activities. Like if you go outdoor zones, you want to go maybe rather fast and you want to include more speed. And if you farm a lot of dungeons, maybe you want to have more single target damage for the bosses and these kind of things. You can always adjust your stuff on the fly for a little gold cost, which is not really that high. And that's also it for what I have to share here for now. Hope you enjoyed this video. As I mentioned, I'm going to have some more of those build showcases coming up. And I wish you good luck, have fun on Friday or during the weekend for the open beta. See you guys next time.